Hey everyone, Melissa here, and this is a quick message thanking you so much for all of the donations to the podcast that we've seen coming in. We work so hard to provide you with original, ad-free short stories, and the financial support really helps us keep creating, so we appreciate you seeing, hearing, and feeling that, and thank you. Also, another big thank you for nominating us for an AMPI Award in the Creator category with the City of Peoria, Arizona. That's where our podcast is headquartered. If you're on our email list, you would have got that message. We'll let you know if we win. We love highlighting the works of modern authors and human narrators, as well as building a strong, caring community with people like you. Now back to our program. Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthologies. Written by Don Muchow and narrated by Melissa Del Toro Schaffner. The Unwishing Well. The hollow-hearted man made his way breathlessly up the barren hill toward the lone landmark, a solitary well, the March wind beating at his back and pelting him with fat, cold raindrops. The very sky, gray and heavy as his mood, seemed to close in around him, chilling him to the soul and making him feel old. Picking his way among the rocks and weeds, feet slipping on thick, cloying mud, he approached the small structure with a sense of relief and anticipation. With the years, he had grown distant and detached, all senses numbed. He had fallen horribly in love with a dark-haired woman half his age, and for a moment the sun seemed to shine. But his one brief excursion into light had ended horribly with the dissolution of all that he cared about. Now, all he wanted was to forget. And thus it was with the others over countless centuries, each carrying the weight of the wasted life's memories to a hole in the ground where legend held that the first emperors drowned their sorrows. It was said that into this well were thrown all the memories that people wanted to forget. He wondered if any place were large enough to contain such a thing, and marveled at how it could be held. To this day, he had been so focused on oblivion to render concern for anything but his own misery. Not long now, he thought, and it will be taken from me. A feeling of relief spread over him as he looked over the weed-encrusted edge of the circle of rugged stones and into the vacant space below, and for a moment lost all sense of time and place. A sound came from below, a sort of susurration, low and indefinite, softer than a whisper. Suddenly aware of a feeling of being watched, he looked up and glanced around. But it was nothing but the wind, and into this wind he released her memory. Years later, 2 men and a woman watched sheep grazing on a hillside. The 3 of them, Cavuto, Mariela, and neighbor Charles, basked in the evening sun as the sheep stood placidly in the distance, heads buried in the thick yellow-green grass. They didn't seem to mind it when Cavuto's collie ran around their heels, yipping and crouching to nudge them back home after dark. Cavuto and Mariela had been together for 50 years, and neither one of them remembered how long the herd had wandered the verdant fields and valleys below the town of 1100. Charles said that it had been at least since the Saracens. One thing Cavuto remembered, though, was that none of the sheep ever went anywhere near the top of the hill, where it was said that there stood the entrance to an old mine, or mausoleum, or cave. Little, in fact, was known about the place, and none of them could recall anyone in the village ever having been there. Mariela thought she might have once remembered seeing young lovers crossing the field to attend to desire in the woods beyond. The conversation devolved into a discussion among the 2 men of an assortment of legends and speculation about the true nature of what lay within. It was in the midst of such an offhand banter that Mariela, who among the trio was most often inclined to fancy, heard Cavuto's dog barking and thought she saw a traveler cresting the hill. Wondering if perhaps it was one of the soldiers returning home from the war in the East, she turned and followed the men back inside. casting a last glance over her shoulder in the fading light. The traveler could no longer remember if he had a name, for he had no one with whom to share it, but it mattered little. He had learned to live on little and enjoyed the open air. The forest and fields were his home, the sun and moon his guardians. As daylight retreated with the sheep, he stared at his window and lit a handmade cigarette, nursing the flame until it caught. He sat there smoking until it was almost done, then put it out with some earnestness and opened his backpack. In it were the half-eaten remains of a sandwich he'd been offered by a stranger, and enough provisions to last the night. Tomorrow, he'd fashion a spear from the woods on the far side of the hill and forage for wild berries along the south edge of the fence surrounding the property, feeding off them until he found a creek deep enough for fishing. He didn't dare kill even one of the sheep. Others had been hanged for less. Behind him beckoned the mouth of a cave, quite unusual to find in a hillside, and the ring of fallen stones that encircled it hinted at its history. Had it once served an intentional purpose? Mausoleum? Root cellar? Treasure hoard? It was no longer possible to tell, just the ring of stones, which further inside held a little of their original structure. Taking the sandwich, rolling papers, and a bag of tobacco and stuffing them in his pocket, he shouldered the backpack and decided to explore just a bit before the sun completely set. The stone tunnel quickly dove, leading so sharply down that he had to climb down the rock face by clinging to it with his fingertips. At the bottom lay soft, cool earth, and the tunnel continued. He lit a second cigarette, and the walls leapt into a nacreous yellow glow. On both sides of the tunnel were sconces, mounted roughly 10 feet apart, for the next 30 feet or so, and in one of them, the remains of a torch. Feeling the match burning his fingers, he reached out and lit the torch. It was ragged and dry, and little lit ashes fell to the floor for a while before the thing finally caught fire. It was then he could see the rest of the cave. Cobblestones lined the floor for some distance ahead, and the passageway crested a low rise and continued to descend at an incline while turning left. He thought that around the corner might be an alcove or at least a wider spot where he could bunk for the night. Seeing a second and third unlit torch to his right, he stowed them in the backpack and proceeded down the incline and around the corner. The weather outside must have been getting worse, for at the edge of his hearing he could discern the whistling, whispering sound of wind gusts. Spring was fickle. While its daylight voice spoke of life and gave the first hints of the land's bounty, it took a toll on those who didn't prepare. He hunkered down and planned for an extended stay. He was unprepared for what he saw next. Stretching before him lay an impossibly large cavern, lit from within by a dim, moon-like glow. He was near the top, and rivulets of orange flickered and ran as the walls caught light of his torch. A nearly black expanse of gnarled, leafless trees stretched out before him for some distance and engulfed the path a few feet beyond his shoes. Less traveled branches led off crookedly to the left and right. Something with wings screeched as it swooped down from behind him into what had moments before been an empty space and collided with his head. As it fluttered away, he dropped the torch, beating at his head until he was certain it was gone. He reached into his pocket for another match. There were 8 left. The torch had rolled a short distance away, under thick branches. He used one of the matches on the torch, raising it high overhead as he made a circle with his arm. Bats! He tried to remember what he had read about domestic bats, but all he could recall was that they hunted for moths and mosquitoes at dusk and lived in high, protected places. He gathered up a few dry sticks to make a fire, and the thought of spending the evening in this place under complete darkness left him unsettled. Meanwhile, he let his eyes wander in search of more defensible shelter. Perhaps it was the light, but as his eyes took in the cave, it seemed larger, more alien, and somehow more menacing. And for the first time since he had descended into the cave, he felt a vague unease and a sense of longing. After a few minutes, it disappeared. Not far away, he spotted what looked like another cave mouth, perhaps 50 yards across a fairly navigable path. Looking back to remember the way he had come, he set out for the opening. What should have been 10 minutes stretched out to more like an hour, as the path was anything but navigable. The way was strewn with mud and twigs and bits of leaf debris that slid beneath his already wet and soggy feet. At last, he reached the mouth of the cave, and after a brief examination that revealed yet another warren of passages, returned. He sat down, placed the dry bundle of twigs just outside the entrance, and lit it with a torch. He thought he smelled creosote, as the orange flame mixed with bits and spurts of blue. Nevertheless, it was nice to have a fire, the feeling more comfortable for the first time in a while. He laid the torch a few feet behind himself and sat down to eat what was left of the sandwich. By his best guess, it was about 9 o'clock in the evening. He didn't bother with a timepiece, as no man kept hours better than the sun. And yet, in this sunless place, he became aware of a desire to know what time it was. But it wasn't worth the trip back to the entrance to check the moon, and there were things abroad at night which saw man as no threat. He took off his jacket, folded it up, and tried to get some sleep. An hour or two later, he was awakened by the sound of footsteps and rustling. The torch behind him had snuffed itself out, but the fire at the entrance was still burning in a sort of haphazard way. He glanced around before sitting up. Seeing nothing, he wiped his eyes and raised himself up, yawning but hyper-aware. When he opened them, there was a woman standing before him. From the looks of it, she might have been somewhere between 25 and 35 years of age, with straight black hair that emerged from beneath a blue hood and ran to an abrupt, dramatic stop just above her jawline. She was dressed in a robe, or cloak of sorts, that covered most of her garments, so he couldn't tell much more. In the weak light, it took his eyes a few moments to adjust. When he was able to see clearly, he could tell that she was little more than a shadow, a vaporous haze in the flickering light. As he watched, she mouthed a single word. "Remember." Then she was gone. It was some time before he fell asleep again. He tossed and turned as his mind was assaulted by a vivid stream of frightening images. In his dreams, a man wandered alone among the ruins of his hometown, looking for family. In the distance, explosions rocked the earth. People dove for cover or were blown free and didn't get up. Crackling, roaring firestorms silenced the screams. The survivors fled to rivers and oceans with no hopes of rescue. Those shell-shocked and injured crept among bodies of the newly dead, through the shattered remains of lives forever altered, from the rubble of nameless towns and villages to yet others more viciously stricken. And all the while, shouting, weeping, and the keening whistle that preceded another explosion, and another, and another. He slept fitfully and without rest for perhaps the next 2 hours before awakening to an urgent need to attend to nature. His heart pounding in his chest, he made his way around the smoldering embers of the fire and into the open area beyond the cave's entrance. Stumbling a few steps to one side, he leaned against a rock wall and relieved himself. When he was done, he glanced at the forested hollow around which he'd trekked earlier during his 1-hour shortcut to the cave. This time, it seemed as though the cavern, the path he'd traveled, the forest, everything, were smaller, shorter, and less expansive in some vague, unplaceable way. And indeed, as he ducked inside to retrieve his backpack and the 2 good torches, the cave within seemed smaller too, barely large enough for a man. He shivered, shouldering the pack and trying to shake the cobwebs from his head, but the dream would not depart, and the image of the woman kept coming back. Was she a ghost? A prophet? A vision? Who was she? Where did she come from? And why? By his own reckoning, much of the night had passed, and he had no interest in caving beyond the need for shelter, so he decided to head back to the surface. Dumping fresh earth on the remnants of the fire, he made his way gingerly across the muddy field that, nevertheless, was the most direct path back, and the only one that didn't require negotiation of dense forest by dim light. This time, the going was faster, and he was across the divide in a matter of 20 minutes or so. By the time he reached the foot of the path leading up to the main entrance, though, something was different. The way up was blocked by an opaque, undulating blackness. His first thought was that one of the larger trees had fallen, the canopy blown back by some invisible gust. But as he moved closer, he could see that what blocked his way was more of a black, sooty fog, at points so thick that he could not see the way ahead. As he got closer, shapes formed and faded in the mist. A young soldier, still holding his weapon, helmet caked with blood and gore, reached from the thick wall of the cloud and was drawn back into it. A little girl, face as pale as linen, wandered aimlessly, clutching a doll, from one roiling bank and into another. A man in a long, blood-soaked overcoat helped a woman up from beside the path, only to be drawn back with her into the mist. Doing his best to disbelieve, he pressed forward, eyes closed, walking steadily ahead. But as he did, he could feel the clinging, beseeching grasp of the cloud, a fetid, repellent moistness that was almost physical. Briefly, a memory of the bats returned, and he opened his eyes, hands flailing around his head, and raced toward the bottom of the path. But it was not the bats. The black cloud now enveloped and enshrouded him, and no longer permitted a view of his destination. The shapes seemed more solid now, the faces clearer. He felt trapped. Keeping his head down, he dodged and elbowed his way back toward where he thought he'd been, but the crowd kept penning him in. A rage welled up inside him as he remembered the 2 torches he still had. Shouting, he motioned the crowd back, reaching into his backpack and taking one out, then fumbled for the matches in his pocket. Surely he still had them. Then he remembered that he had slept on his coat, and that they might have fallen out on the previous night. He waved the unlit torch in a wide circle as he rummaged vigorously through every one of his pockets. From his left, a hand grabbed his arm. It was cold and solid, and he was forced to look up. A woman, maybe 30. She had long black hair and blue eyes. He could see now. Behind her gaze lay intimations of profound loss, regret, and unhappiness. She made as if to talk, but was swept away into the crowd. It was no longer a black mist now, but a shadowy horde of physical beings intent upon a purpose that seemed to lie just beyond him, somewhere. He glanced behind, hoping to find a break and make it back up the hill and to the surface, but his attention was split, and if there had been an opening, it was gone now. He looked back downwards, hoping to find the woman and get some answers. He thought he saw her hood as she moved among the others, making her way to the side. He ran after her, stumbling on the roadside and tumbling down the embankment, his back lodged against one of the black trees. He stood up and chased after her, but it seemed now that the embankment rose to an indefinite height, and no attempt to scale it met with any progress. Beside him, the horror-stricken faces of war-ravaged men, women, and children met his gaze, their hands clawing and scrambling feverishly to escape some uncertain shared fate. After what seemed like an eternity, he crested the roadside. The way up was clear now, and the path that ran past the bats looked unoccupied. Behind him, the clawing horde retreated down the embankment. He looked up. There was only the one hill now, a short turn around the corner, and up a brick-lined wall to the outside. But as he watched, this time he saw the path stretch visibly, widening and lengthening, and at the periphery of his vision, he felt the cave growing. He wanted nothing now but to get out. More images now. Fields strewn with bodies, faces frozen in entreaty. Vehicles left unattended, their drivers unable to guide them. He shook his head and blinked. The road ahead now went on for miles. If nothing changed, and if he made a forced march of it, he might be at the top, near the well entrance, within an hour. An hour. He wondered if he could last that long. Fearing the worst, he broke into a run across the rutted, uneven terrain. Stumbling, he got up again and kept going, trying to forget what he had seen. But the road stretched onward, and he was making no progress. And after 3 more hours, he began to give up. Exhausted, he slackened his pace, at first to a walk, then to an affectless shuffle. He wished none of this had ever happened, that he could put forever out of his mind the death and carnage and oblivion that had found so welcome a receptacle in his head. But he could not. Even now, he felt it clinging to him, searching for a new home, weighing him down. He was half inclined to look back, but was afraid of what he would find. Dragging himself forward, he clambered through the rocks and mud until he got purchase on something solid, heaving his tattered body forward and upward. At last, he felt the path rise to fresher air and heartened. He rested, and there fell into that sleep from which few have ever awakened. The insistent barking of Cavuto's sheepdog drew his master's attention away from the wandering herd and toward the cave entrance. Cavuto followed some paces behind. Fear of the place weighed heavily on the gullible Cavuto, but not so heavily on Charles, who was first to find the body lying in the shadow limestone hollow, covered by a thin layer of moist black leaves. "Vagrant," said Charles. "Trespasser." He was a man of few words. Cavuto stepped forward and looked down. He shrugged, uncertain or dissatisfied. It was hard to tell which. Charles thought for a minute, turned and spat tobacco, and assessed the situation once more. "Traveler? Veteran?" "Perhaps all of these," said Cavuto. "Mariella says she saw a man crossing last night. She sees these things, all those bad memories. It's not a surprise. So many returning from the war these days, you know. And many who do not," said Charles. "Let us not forget." Thank you for listening. We are always striving to bring you the best stories and storytelling here at the Untold Tales podcast. Please share this podcast with your friends and family and anybody who might be a sci-fi buff. We know they'll love it. And if you'd like to support the show for about 1 cup of coffee a month, you can go to the link on the bottom of the show notes in every episode and find a Support This Podcast link. We value bringing original, high-quality stories to you every month, and we appreciate your support to keep this podcast ad-free. Thank you so much, and have a great day.